He signed my name like it already belonged to him. I remember thinking that as I stood a few feet behind my nephew, watching his hand move across the paper with a confidence that didn't match the truth, the fluorescent lights of the bank casting a cold glow over everything, making the polished marble floors and glass partitions feel even more distant, more sterile, as if I had stepped into a place where emotions didn't matter, only signatures did, only numbers, only ownership. And yet there I was, a 68-year-old woman clutching her purse just a little tighter, trying to steady the quiet shift happening inside my chest as I realized that the boy I had once tucked into bed, the boy who used to call me every Sunday afternoon without fail, was now standing at a counter pretending to be me, pretending he had the right to take something that had taken me a lifetime to build. And the strangest part is not the act itself, but the ease with which he did it. The way he didn't even glance over his shoulder, didn't hesitate, didn't question whether anyone might be watching, as if in his mind, I had already become invisible, already become someone whose presence no longer needed to be acknowledged, and I stayed there, quiet, still, observing, because something told me that reacting too soon would only give him what he expected, a scene, a confrontation, something he could twist or dismiss. But silence was something else entirely. Silence was a mirror, and I wanted to see just how far he was willing to go when he believed no one was holding it up to him. The bank itself was busy that morning, the low hum of conversations blending with the soft tapping of keyboards and the occasional chime of a teller calling the next customer, and I could see the young woman behind the counter offering him a polite smile, unaware, or perhaps uncertain, as she processed the form he had just handed her, her eyes flickering briefly between the signature and the account number, and then back to his face, searching for something that would make it all make sense. And Ethan, he simply smiled back, that same charming smile he had perfected over the years, the one that used to make teachers praise him, neighbors trust him, and apparently now, bank employees lower their guard, and I felt a slow, deliberate calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from clarity, because in that moment, everything aligned. The questions I had been quietly asking myself over the past few months, the small inconsistencies, the subtle changes in his tone whenever money came up, the way he had started asking about my accounts, my investments, my plans, always framed as concern, always wrapped in that same easy charm, and I had let it pass at first because that's what you do when you love someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself you're imagining things, that you're reading too much into harmless questions, but standing there now, watching him forge my name with the kind of confidence that only comes from practice, I understood that none of it had been harmless. None of it had been accidental. This was intentional, calculated, and far more familiar to him than I had ever allowed myself to believe. I shifted my weight slightly, the leather sole of my shoe making the faintest sound against the floor, and for a brief second, I wondered if he would turn, if something in him would sense that I was there, that I had seen everything, but he didn't. He just leaned a little closer to the counter, pointing at a line on the document, speaking in a low voice I couldn't quite hear, and the teller nodded, typing something into her computer, and that was when I noticed it. The way the manager, a man I recognized from years of coming to this branch, had stepped out of his office and was now standing just a few feet away, his eyes not on Ethan but on me, and there was something in his expression, something subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition, of hesitation, as if he was trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew, and I met his gaze without changing my expression, without offering any signal, because this wasn't the moment for explanations. This was the moment for observation, for patience, for letting the scene unfold exactly as it was meant to, because Ethan believed he was in control. He believed he understood the situation completely, and I was not about to take that belief away from him too soon. Not before I understood the full extent of what he was willing to do. Not before I saw just how far he would go when he thought I was nothing more than a name on a piece of paper, and as he lifted the pen from the document and slid it back across the counter, I realized that this moment, this quiet, almost unremarkable moment in a bank on an ordinary morning, was not the beginning of something. It was the confirmation of something that had been building for a long time, something I had chosen not to see, and now that I did, I wasn't going to look away. I did not move right away after he handed the paper back. because sometimes the truth reveals itself not in the act, but in what follows after, in the small pauses, in the way people carry themselves when they believe they have succeeded. And Ethan straightened his jacket with a subtle sense of satisfaction, his shoulders relaxed, his expression calm, as if he had just completed something routine, something entirely within his rights. And I watched him carefully, noticing how easily he blended back into the rhythm of the bank, how quickly he became just another customer waiting for confirmation. And that was when I understood something that settled deeper than anger ever could. This was not desperation. This was not a mistake. This was familiarity, and familiarity only comes from repetition, from confidence built over time, which meant this moment was not isolated. It was part of a pattern. And I felt a quiet shift in my memory begin to rearrange itself. Small details from the past, months rising to the surface with a clarity I had not allowed before. The afternoon he insisted on helping me organize my financial documents, the way he lingered over account numbers just a second too long, the time he offered to simplify my online banking, saying it would be easier for me if he set everything up, the casual questions about my savings, my investments, my retirement plans, always framed as concern, always delivered with that same easy tone. And I had smiled, thanked him, even felt grateful in a way that now made my chest tighten, because I had mistaken curiosity for care. And now I could see the difference. Now I could see the intention behind every question, every suggestion, every moment I had dismissed as harmless. And as the teller typed something into her system, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, I noticed the manager step closer, his attention no longer divided, his eyes moving between Ethan and the screen in front of the teller, and then briefly, again, to me, and there was a tension there, a quiet uncertainty that had not existed before, as if something did not align, as if a detail was out of place in a way that could not yet be explained. And Ethan, he did not notice any of it. He leaned slightly forward, resting his hand on the counter, speaking in a tone that suggested confidence, even impatience, the kind of tone people use when they expect the world to move according to their request. And I remained where I was, my hand steady, my breathing even. Because there is a kind of power and restraint that most people never learn, the ability to wait, to observe, to allow someone to fully reveal themselves before you step into the light. And I realized then that confronting him immediately would only cut the story short, would only give me a fragment of the truth. And I wanted all of it. I wanted to understand not just what he was doing, but how long he had been doing it, how far it had gone, how much of my life he believed he could quietly take, without consequence. And as the seconds stretched, I noticed the teller hesitate, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her polite smile fading just enough to reveal uncertainty, and she glanced at the manager, who gave a small nod, the kind that is meant to reassure but does not fully conceal doubt. And Ethan followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at the screen, his expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing over again. And that was the first crack, the first sign that something in this carefully constructed moment was not unfolding exactly as he expected. And I felt that same calm settle deeper, because now the situation was no longer his alone. Now it belonged to the room, to the people who were beginning to notice that something was not quite right. And I took a small step forward, not enough to draw attention, but enough to close the distance, enough to ensure that when the moment came, I would not be an observer anymore, but a presence that could not be ignored. And as I moved, I thought about the years behind us, about the child he had been, the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table doing his homework while I prepared dinner, the one who would look up and ask questions about everything, about how things worked, about why certain decisions mattered. And I had answered him, patiently, carefully, believing that I was teaching him how to build something of his own, never imagining that one day he would use that knowledge to try and take what was mine. And there was no anger in that realization, not yet. Only a kind of clarity that felt almost cold, because the truth, when it finally arrives, does not shout, it does not demand. It simply stands there, undeniable, waiting for you to acknowledge it. And I did, standing in that bank, watching my nephew wait for approval on a transaction that should never have existed, understanding now that whatever happened next would not be a surprise, it would be a consequence. The room shifted in a way that most people would not notice, but I did, because when you have spent a lifetime paying attention to small details, you learn that change rarely announces itself loudly. It moves quietly in glances and pauses in the way a conversation slows down by half a second too long. And I saw it now in the teller's hands as she stopped typing completely, her fingers resting on the keyboard, as if she had suddenly remembered something important, something that did not align with what was in front of her. And she looked at the manager again, this time not for reassurance, but for direction, and he stepped closer to the counter, his posture professional but no longer casual, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the document Ethan had signed. And I watched Ethan notice it too, not fully, not yet, but enough that his body stiffened just a fraction, enough that his confidence adjusted into something more careful, more measured. And he cleared his throat, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, as if trying to regain control of a situation he believed was still his to manage, and I could almost hear the thoughts behind that expression, the quiet calculation, the assumption that whatever hesitation was happening could be explained away, smoothed over, corrected with the right words, because that had always been his strength, the ability to talk his way through discomfort, to redirect attention before it settled too deeply, and for a moment, I let myself remember the first time I had seen that skill. He was no more than 10 years old, standing in my kitchen with flour on his hands and a broken mixing bowl at his feet, explaining with perfect sincerity that it had simply slipped, that it was an accident, that he had been trying to help, and I had believed him, because I wanted to, because love makes it easy to accept the version of events that hurts the least. And now, standing in this bank, I realized how long that pattern had lasted, how often I had chosen comfort over clarity, and how easily that choice had allowed something else to grow beneath the surface, something quieter, something far less innocent. And the manager finally spoke, his voice calm, polite, but carrying a firmness that changed the air around us, asking Ethan a question I could not hear, but could understand from the way Ethan responded, a slight hesitation, a brief flicker of uncertainty, followed by an answer that came just a little too quickly, just a little too rehearsed, and I saw the manager nod slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind of nod that signals a conversation is not finished, only paused, and the teller turned her screen slightly toward him, pointing at something I could not see, and he leaned in, his expression tightening in a way that confirmed what I already knew, that whatever Ethan had presented, whatever story he had constructed, was beginning to unravel under the weight of its own details. And still, I did not speak, because there is a moment in every situation where intervention becomes inevitable, and I was waiting for that moment, not rushing it, not forcing it, because timing is not about speed, it is about precision, and I wanted this to be precise. I wanted every assumption he had made to remain intact until the very second it collapsed, and I took another step forward, close enough now to hear the low murmur of their voices, the careful phrasing, the polite questions, the subtle shift from routine service to cautious verification, and Ethan's tone changed again, softer now, more insistent, as if trying to guide the conversation back to familiar ground, back to a place where he felt secure, and I could see the effort it took, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the counter before going still, and I realized then that this was the first time he had truly encountered resistance, the first time the world had not simply accepted what he presented without question, and it showed, not in anything dramatic, but in the smallest details, the kind most people overlook, but I never did. And the manager straightened, holding the document in his hand now, his gaze moving once more toward me, lingering just a second longer than before, as if confirming something silently, something unspoken but understood. And in that brief exchange, I knew he recognized me, not just as a customer, but as something more, something connected to this place in a way Ethan had clearly failed to consider. And I felt that same calm settle deeper, because now the situation had reached the point where silence was no longer about observation, it was about choice, and I was choosing to step forward, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the kind of certainty that does not need to raise its voice. And as I closed the final distance between us, I understood that whatever happened next would not be about proving anything to Ethan, it would be about showing him something he had never taken the time to learn, that there are some things in this world you cannot take, simply because you believe no one is watching, and there are some people you should never mistake for invisible, no matter how quietly they stand. When I finally stepped beside him, I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my hand lightly on the edge of the counter, close enough for both the teller and the manager to see, and close enough for Ethan to feel my presence before he fully registered it, and I watched the exact moment it happened, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the fraction of a second where his breath paused before he turned his head, and when he did, his expression changed in layers, first confusion, then recognition, and then something deeper, something closer to disbelief, as if the possibility of me standing there had never truly existed in his version of events, and I met his eyes without anger, without accusation, because I did not need either. The truth was already here, sitting between us in the form of a document he had just signed, and the manager spoke again, this time addressing me directly, his tone respectful, careful, using my name in a way that confirmed what I had already sensed, that he knew exactly who I was, and that single detail changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because now the room had context, now the quiet uncertainty had direction, and Ethan felt it. I could see it in the way he straightened slightly, the way his smile returned but did not quite settle, as if he was trying to recover a version of himself that no longer fit the situation, and I let a small moment pass before speaking, just enough time for the weight of the silence to settle. And when I did, my voice was calm, steady, the same voice I had used for years in conversations that required clarity more than volume, and I asked him a simple question, one that did not accuse, did not demand, but left no room for misunderstanding, asking him to explain what exactly he was trying to do with my account, and the way he responded told me more than any answer could have. The hesitation, the quick glance toward the manager, the careful selection of words that sounded rehearsed even as he spoke them, and I listened without interrupting, because sometimes letting someone finish their explanation reveals more than stopping them ever could, and as he spoke, I noticed the teller's expression shift again, her uncertainty now replaced with something closer to concern, her eyes moving between us as if she was beginning to understand the full shape of the situation, and the manager held the document in his hand, not returning it, not setting it down, simply holding it as a quiet reminder of what had already been done, and I let Ethan finish, let his explanation settle into the air where it could be seen clearly for what it was, and then I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, asking him when exactly I had given him permission to act on my behalf, and this time there was no immediate answer. Only silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to become undeniable, and I could feel the room shift again, the quiet hum of the bank continuing around us, but this small space at the counter now existing in its own stillness, its own clarity, and I thought about the years behind us, about the choices that had led to this moment, about the trust that had been given freely and the way it had been used, not with gratitude, but with assumption, and there was no anger in that thought, only a kind of final understanding, because anger requires surprise, and I was no longer surprised, and the manager finally spoke, his tone firm but still measured, asking for clarification about the authorization, about the documentation that should have supported what Ethan was attempting, and Ethan tried again, offering another explanation, adjusting his words, shifting his tone. But it was different now, less certain, less controlled, because the situation had moved beyond his expectations, beyond the version he had prepared for, and I stood there, steady, present, allowing the truth to unfold in its own time, because this was not about catching him in a mistake. It was about revealing a pattern, a belief, an assumption that had guided his actions long before this moment. And as the silence returned, heavier now, more defined, I realized that everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of us, not in raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the simple fact that he had signed a name that was not his, in a place where every signature carries weight and every action leaves a record, and I looked at him one more time, not searching for an apology, not expecting an explanation, but simply acknowledging the truth that now existed between us, clear, undeniable, and no longer hidden behind charm or familiarity, and I knew then that whatever came next would not change what had already been revealed. It would only confirm it. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy with everything that had already been revealed, and I could see Ethan searching for something to hold on to, some version of control he could still claim, but it was slipping now, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something that had never truly belonged to him in the first place, and the manager shifted the document slightly in his hand, turning it just enough for both of us to see, and there it was, my name, written. In a way that tried to imitate familiarity but missed the details, the small curves, the spacing, the rhythm that only comes from years of signing your own name, and I did not point it out. I did not need to, because the truth of it was already visible, already understood by everyone standing there, and the manager asked another question, this time more direct, about the authorization on file, about the records that would support what Ethan had attempted, and I watched as Ethan hesitated again. Longer this time, his answer slower, less certain, and the teller glanced back at her screen, typing carefully, verifying something that now clearly did not align, and I remained still, letting the process unfold, because this was no longer about what I knew. It was about what could be confirmed, documented, established in a way that could not be denied or reshaped later, and I thought about the months behind us, about the quiet changes I had dismissed, the way he had grown more interested in details that had never concerned him before, the way his questions had shifted from casual curiosity to something more precise, more focused, and I realized now that I had seen the signs, I had simply chosen not to follow them to their conclusion, because that conclusion required a kind of acceptance I had not been ready for, and yet here we were, standing in a place where every action leaves a record, where every decision is traced and verified, and there was a certain clarity in that, a certain inevitability, because unlike conversations or memories, this could not be rewritten, and the manager finally set the document down on the counter, not in dismissal but in recognition, and he addressed Ethan again, his tone no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but firm in a way that signaled the situation had reached its conclusion, explaining that without proper authorization, without verified documentation, no transaction could proceed, and that any attempt to act on another person's account required clear and valid consent, and Ethan nodded as if he understood, as if this was simply a misunderstanding, a procedural issue that could be corrected, but I could see the shift in his eyes, the realization that this was not something he could talk his way through, not something that could be smoothed over with charm or explanation, and I spoke then, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify, stating plainly that I had not given any permission, that I had not signed any document authorizing him to act on my behalf, and the words settled into the space with a finality that could not be undone, and the manager acknowledged them with a small nod, his attention now fully aligned with the facts in front of him, and the teller stopped typing, her hands resting quietly as she looked at the screen one last time, confirming what we all already knew, and Ethan stepped back slightly, creating a small distance between himself and the counter, between himself and the document, as if that space might somehow separate him from what had just occurred, and I watched him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a kind of steady recognition, because this moment was not just about what he had done, it was about what he had believed, that he could take something simply, because he understood how it worked, that knowledge alone granted him access, that familiarity replaced permission, and I realized then that this was the belief that needed to be confronted, not with force, not with raised voices, but with something far more difficult to ignore, the reality of consequence, the understanding that actions carry weight beyond intention, and as the manager began to explain the next steps, the procedures that would follow, the need to review the account, to ensure its security, I felt that same calm remain, unchanged, because this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of clarity, the moment where everything that had been hidden in small details and quiet assumptions was now visible, documented, and no longer open to interpretation, and I stood there, steady, present, knowing that whatever came next would not erase what had happened, it would simply define what it meant. The manager's voice remained steady as he outlined the procedures, but I was no longer focused on the words themselves. I was watching Ethan, watching the way his composure tried to rebuild itself piece by piece, the way he nodded as if this were simply an inconvenience, something temporary, something that could be corrected later with the right conversation, and I recognized that instinct immediately, because it was the same instinct I had seen years ago when he would make small mistakes and try to smooth them over before they became consequences, but this was different now. This was not a broken bowl in a quiet kitchen. This was a record, a system, a a place where actions did not disappear just because someone wished them to, and I let the manager finish before I spoke again, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, asking him to review the full history of my account, not just what had happened today, but everything, every authorization, every attempted access, every change that had been made or requested over the past year, and I saw the shift in his expression, the understanding that this was no longer a single incident, that there was a possibility of something larger, something that required attention beyond the immediate moment, and he nodded, professional, composed, already moving into that next level of responsibility, and the teller began typing again, this time with a different focus. Pulling up records, scanning through entries, her eyes moving more carefully. Now, more deliberately, and Ethan turned toward me, his voice lower, almost controlled, asking if we could step aside, if we could talk about this privately, and I looked at him for a moment before answering, not with refusal, but with stillness, because privacy had already been used once as a shield, as a way to keep things unexamined, and I was not interested in returning to that space, not now, not when everything was finally visible, and I told him calmly that there was nothing to discuss. Privately, that whatever needed to be said could be said here, in the same place where the action had taken place, and that was when I saw it. Not anger, not frustration, but something closer to realization, the understanding that this situation was not going to be reshaped into something smaller, something quieter, something easier to control, and the teller spoke then, her voice careful, respectful, but carrying a new certainty, mentioning that there had been previous attempts to access the account, not completed, not successful, but recorded, flagged in a way that had not required immediate escalation at the time, and I felt that information settle into place with a kind of quiet confirmation, because it aligned perfectly with what I had begun to understand, that this had not started today, that today was simply the moment it had reached visibility, and the manager asked a few more questions, verifying details, confirming timelines, and Ethan remained still, his responses minimal. Now, measured, as if each word required more effort than the last, and I watched him carefully, not with judgment, but with clarity, because this was the part most people misunderstand. They believe the moment of exposure is the end, but it is not. It is the beginning of understanding, the moment when actions are no longer abstract, when they take on weight, when they are seen not as intentions but as choices, and I stepped back slightly, giving the teller and the manager space to continue their work, because this was no longer something I needed to direct. The system was doing what it was designed to do. It was recording, verifying, protecting, and I realized then that the real shift had already happened, not in the bank, not in the documents, but in me, in the way I was no longer searching for explanations that would make this easier to accept, no longer looking for a version of events that would soften what had occurred, and as the manager explained that additional safeguards would be placed on the account, that any future access would require direct confirmation, I nodded, not because I needed reassurance but because I understood the necessity of it, and Ethan stood there, quieter now, his presence no longer commanding the space the way it had just minutes ago, and I thought about the difference between those two moments, how quickly confidence can change when it is no longer supported by assumption, and I spoke one last time, not to him, but to the manager, asking that any previous documentation connected to my account be reviewed thoroughly, that any irregularities be documented clearly, because clarity is the only thing that prevents repetition, and the manager agreed, his tone firm, committed, and I felt that same calm remain unchanged because what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be understood had been understood, and whatever came next would not alter that, it would only define how it was addressed. And I stood there, steady, knowing that this was not about reclaiming something that had been taken. It was about ensuring that nothing like this would ever be attempted again under the illusion that it could go unnoticed. I had almost reached the edge of the counter when something inside me told me not to leave just yet, not because anything more needed to be proven, but because something deeper still had not been said, and I turned back slightly, not fully, just enough to face him again, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed the silence between us to stretch without filling it, because silence has a way of pressing against the truth until it surfaces on its own, and Ethan shifted where he stood, his confidence no longer something he could rely on, his hands no longer steady on the counter but resting awkwardly at his sides, and I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the man standing in front of me now, but as the boy I had once raised, The one who used to sit at my kitchen table with scraped knees and wide questions about the world. The one who trusted me without hesitation, and I let that memory sit there for just a moment before I spoke, my voice calm but carrying something it had not carried before, something quieter but heavier, and I told him that I had spent years building things carefully, not just accounts, not just systems, but trust, relationships, stability, the kind of life that does not happen quickly and does not come easily. And I paused, letting the words settle, letting him hear not just what I was saying but what I was not saying, and then I added that I had trusted him with something far more valuable than money, something I had never needed to explain before because I believed he already understood it, and that was the first moment I saw it. Not confusion, not defensiveness, but something closer to realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once but unfolds slowly, uncomfortably, and I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him directly. I simply asked him if he remembered the last time he sat at my kitchen table, the last time we had spoken without any agenda, without any questions about accounts or numbers, just a conversation, and he did not answer. But the way his expression shifted told me enough, because sometimes the absence of an answer carries more truth than anything spoken aloud, and I continued, not to push, but to make something clear, telling him that what happened here today was not just about a signature or a transaction, it was about a decision, a moment where he chose to believe that I would not see, that I would not understand, that I would not notice the difference between help and control, and I let that settle because that distinction matters. It is the line that separates care from assumption, and once it is crossed, it changes everything. And I saw him swallow slightly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again, and there was something different there now, something less certain, less constructed, and I realized that this was the moment that mattered, not the bank procedures, not the documentation, but this, the point where the truth is no longer external, no longer something being handled by systems or policies, but something internal, something he has to face without guidance, without a script. And I stepped back then, not retreating but creating space again, because I had said what needed to be said, and I knew better than to overfill a moment like this, because when too many words are added, the truth begins to lose its edge, and I did not want that. I wanted it to remain exactly as it was now, clear, sharp, undeniable. And I gave him one final look, not searching for an apology, not expecting anything in return, just acknowledging the reality of what stood between us now. And then I turned away fully, this time without hesitation, because the conversation had reached its natural end. And as I took a step forward, I understood that whatever came after this would not be shaped by what he said next. It would be shaped by what he chose to understand. And that was something no one else could decide for him. I did not look back right away when I stepped out of the manager's office, because some truths do not need to be checked twice to remain real. They settle on their own, steady and unshaken. And as I returned to the main floor, the space felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the way it was seen had shifted, the quiet uncertainty from before replaced with something clearer, something defined. And I could feel it in the way the room carried itself, in the subtle awareness of the staff, in the way the manager remained near his office but no longer watched with concern, only with understanding. And then I saw Ethan again, standing near the counter, not moving, not speaking, just there, as if the ground beneath him had changed in a way he had not expected and could not quite adjust to. And I walked toward him, not with purpose, not with confrontation, simply continuing the path I had already chosen. And as I passed, I slowed just slightly, enough to let the moment exist without forcing it, and I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough for him to hear, telling him that there are systems in this world that do not rely on trust alone, systems built to recognize patterns, to detect when something does not align, and that those systems do not react to intention, they react to action. And I paused for just a second, letting that settle before adding that what he had done today had not been invisible, not because someone happened to be watching, but because it was never designed to be invisible in the first place. And I saw his expression shift again, not with confusion this time, but with realization. The kind that comes when something you believe to be simple reveals a depth you had not considered. And I did not elaborate further because I did not need to. The implication was already clear, already present in the way the room now held him differently than before, and I continued walking, reaching the door once more, my hand resting briefly on the handle, and I allowed myself a moment to think, not about what had just happened, but about everything that had led to it, the years of building, the decisions made quietly, the safeguards put in place not out of fear, but out of understanding, because when you build something of value, you do not leave it unprotected, you design it to stand on its own, to recognize when something is not right, to respond without needing permission. And I realized then that this moment, as unexpected as it had seemed, was simply a reflection of that design. The system working exactly as it was meant to, revealing what needed to be revealed, and I opened the door, stepping into the light again. And as I did, I understood that the power in this situation had never come from confrontation. It had come from awareness, from knowing exactly what was in place long before anyone thought to test it, and that awareness had not needed to be declared. It had only needed to exist, quietly, consistently, until the moment it became undeniable. I stepped outside without hesitation this time, the door closing softly behind me, and for a moment I stood there, not moving, not thinking, just letting the air settle around me in a way that felt different from when I first arrived, because something had changed, not in the world, not in the building behind me, but in the space between what I had believed and what I now understood, and I walked slowly toward my car, each step measured, steady, the kind of pace that does not rush away from something but moves forward with intention, and I thought about him again. Not the man standing uncertainly inside that bank, but the boy he used to be, the one who once trusted me without question. And I realized that what had happened today was not a sudden break. It was the result of something that had been shifting for a long time, quietly, gradually, until it reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden, and there was no anger in that realization, only clarity, because anger belongs to moments of surprise, and I was no longer surprised, and I reached my car, unlocking it with the same small motion I had done thousands of times before, and as I sat down, I allowed myself one brief pause, not to dwell on what had happened, but to acknowledge it fully, because understanding only holds its value when it is recognized completely, without denial, without softening. And I started the engine, the sound grounding, familiar, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I thought about what truly mattered, not the account, not the numbers, but the fact that everything I had built was never dependent on being trusted blindly. It was built to stand even when trust was tested, even when it was misunderstood. And that realization settled into something steady inside me, something that did not need to be spoken to remain true, and I merged into the road, the traffic moving in its usual rhythm, the world continuing without pause. And I understood then that this was not a moment that would define me. It was a moment that revealed something else, something I could not ignore but did not need to carry as a burden. And whatever came next, whatever distance or change would exist between us, it would not be shaped by what he had tried to take, but by what I had chosen to see clearly. And I drove forward without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that needed revisiting. Everything that mattered had already been brought into the light, and once something is seen that clearly, it no longer belongs to doubt. It belongs to truth, and truth does not require attention to remain. It simply stays, quiet and unshaken, long after the moment itself has passed.